Welcome to Have You Read It, the channel where we bring books to life, one summary at a time. Today, we're diving into Jacob Heilbrunn's America. Last, the Right's century-long romance with foreign dictators. This book explores a fascinating and disturbing pattern in American conservatism, a recurring admiration for authoritarian leaders abroad. It's a pattern Heilbrunn traces across the 20th and into the 21st century, from Kaiser Wilhelm to Viktor Orban. Heilbrunn argues this isn't a new phenomenon, but a deeply ingrained aspect of the American right, a persuasion he terms the illiberal imagination. This tendency, he suggests, isn't rooted in realism or pragmatism, but in a genuine affinity for authoritarianism. Conservatives, Heilbrunn argues, often disguise their disdain for American democratic ideals and practices by manipulating the language of liberalism, invoking freedom while seeking to suppress opposing views. America Last contends that this inclination towards authoritarianism isn't un-American, but rather a core element of American history, citing examples like the Jim Crow South and the dispossession of Native Americans. Heilbrunn's own experience as editor of The National Interest provides a unique perspective. He recounts his interactions with various right-wing figures, some of whom entered Trump's orbit. He details the magazine's sponsorship of Trump's foreign policy speech during the 2016 primaries, where Trump's America First rhetoric echoed decades of right-wing grievances. Heilbrunn also describes his encounter with Maria Butina, a Russian agent who advocated for an alliance between the Russian and American right, foreshadowing the unsettling alignment that would emerge during the Trump presidency. He also details the pardon granted by Trump to Conrad Black, a former owner of The National Interest. Heilbrunn notes Black's authorship of a pro-Trump book. These personal anecdotes offer an insider's view of the evolving conservative landscape. The book begins its historical exploration with Kaiser Wilhelm II and of Germany. While acknowledging Wilhelm's monstrous nature and disastrous policies, Heilbrunn highlights the surprising admiration he garnered in America. Figures like H.L. Mencken and George Sylvester Viereck, both with German heritage, championed Wilhelm and German culture, criticizing American intervention in World War I and portraying Wilson as a warmonger. Mencken, a prominent journalist and satirist, and Viereck, a poet and propagandist who later worked for the Nazi regime, used arguments that would become hallmarks of right-wing authoritarian apologetics, including whataboutism, disdain for Western liberalism, and a preference for authoritarianism over democracy. Heilbrunn notes Viereck was eventually prosecuted as a Nazi agent. These early figures laid the groundwork for the right's subsequent defenses of foreign dictators. Following World War I, a wave of historical revisionism swept through America, further fueling the right's embrace of authoritarianism. Figures like Albert J. Nock, a former leftist who became a mentor to William F. Buckley, Jr., and historian Harry Elmer Barnes, who later engaged in Holocaust denial, promoted the view that Germany was a victim of Allied aggression. They downplayed German atrocities, criticized the Treaty of Versailles, and harbored a strong Anglophobia. Heilbrunn highlights the irony of the Allies' insistence on German war guilt in the Treaty of Versailles, which inadvertently facilitated Germany's attempts to evade responsibility. He also notes the influence of Mencken on this historical revisionism, referring to it as Menckenized history. The 1920s and 30s saw the rise of figures like Lothrop Stoddard, a Harvard-educated historian who wrote about the rising tide of color and promoted eugenics and racial hierarchy. Stoddard's work, admired by Presidents Harding and Coolidge, fueled fears of white displacement and influenced immigration restrictions. Heilbrunn connects Stoddard's ideas to those of Madison Grant, whose book The Passing of the Great Race was praised by Hitler. The book also details the rise of fascism in Italy and the admiration it garnered from American intellectuals like Irving Babbitt and Richard Washburn Child, the latter of whom served as ambassador to Italy and lauded Mussolini. Heilbrunn notes that Mussolini himself was not exempt from racial fanaticism. These intellectual currents further solidified the right's attraction to authoritarianism. As the Great Depression took hold, figures like Lawrence Dennis, a black man passing as white, emerged as prominent advocates for American fascism. Dennis, a former State Department official, admired Hitler and Mussolini, arguing that fascism was superior to democracy. Elizabeth Dilling, a fervent anti-communist, also championed the Third Reich, attacking the New Deal and Roosevelt as communist sympathizers. The Spanish Civil War provided another opportunity for the right to celebrate authoritarianism, with figures like Merwin K. Hart, a businessman with ties to the John Birch Society, championing Franco. Hart, like many on the right, equated democracy with communism and warned of a Spanish scenario unfolding in America. Heilbrunn underscores that the Roosevelt administration recognized the danger posed by these pro-fascist sentiments, with figures like Attorney General Robert Jackson and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes publicly denouncing them. During World War II, Viereck resumed his pro-German activities, working as a Nazi agent and lobbying American lawmakers. William Randolph Hearst, a powerful newspaper magnate, also promoted pro-Nazi propaganda and isolationism, even commissioning articles from Hitler and Mussolini. The America First Committee, initially a bipartisan group, was increasingly dominated by right-wing figures and became a platform for Lindbergh's isolationist and anti-Semitic views. Heilbrunn emphasizes the Roosevelt administration's efforts to counter these pro-Nazi movements, including the prosecution of Viereck and the attempted mass trial of American fascists. Following World War II, the right shifted its focus from opposing intervention to criticizing the Truman administration for not doing enough to combat communism. The "Who Lost China" debate became a rallying cry, with figures like William F. Buckley Jr. and Senator Joseph McCarthy accusing the State Department of harboring communist sympathizers. Buckley, heavily influenced by Albert J. Nock and Wilmore Kendall, revitalized the conservative movement, promoting a fusion of elite conservatism and populism, though he initially held America First sentiments. Heilbrunn notes the irony of the right's shift from opposing intervention against Nazism to advocating for aggressive action against communism. The Cold War era saw the right's continued admiration for dictators, including Portugal's Salazar, the Dominican Republic's Trujillo, and Spain's Franco. Buckley himself praised Franco, while his brother-in-law L. Brent Bozell championed theocratic authoritarianism and even engaged in violent anti-abortion protests. The right also supported Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA in Angola, portraying him as a freedom fighter despite his authoritarian tendencies and ties to the apartheid regime in South Africa. Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's ambassador to the UN, provided an intellectual framework for supporting right-wing dictators, arguing that they were more amenable to reform than communist regimes. Heilbrunn criticizes Kirkpatrick's support for the Argentine junta during the Falklands War and notes the eventual failure of the right's backing of Savimbi. With the end of the Cold War, Patrick Buchanan revived the America First rhetoric, opposing the Gulf War and criticizing American interventionism. Buchanan, who expressed admiration for Hitler and defended Saddam Hussein, clashed with neoconservatives, accusing them of dual loyalty to Israel. His America First platform resonated with a segment of the right, particularly in the wake of the Iraq War. Heilbrunn notes the irony of Buchanan receiving a congratulatory telegram from Russian nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky. In the 21st century, figures like Christopher Caldwell and Sohrab Ahmari championed Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian prime minister who has constructed an illiberal democracy. Caldwell praised Orbán's stance against immigration and wokeness, while Ahmari, a former critic of Orbán, became a supporter. Tucker Carlson also promoted Orban and Hungarian illiberalism, broadcasting his show from Budapest. Heilbrunn points to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's emulation of Orbán's tactics in targeting academic freedom and the deep state. He also mentions Trump's admiration for Putin and attempts to undermine NATO and Ukraine. Heilbrunn concludes by highlighting the real-world consequences of the right's embrace of authoritarianism, pointing to figures like Douglas MacGregor, who defended Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and the efforts of Trump and his allies to undermine American support for Ukraine. He criticizes Tucker Carlson's fervent support for Russia and Hungary, and expresses concern over the growing influence of illiberal ideas within the Republican Party, exemplified by DeSantis's policies in Florida. The book ends with a visit to the House of Terror Museum in Budapest, a stark reminder of the dangers of both Nazism and communism, and a reflection on the recurring patterns of illiberalism throughout history. The main takeaway from America Last is that the right's romance with foreign dictators isn't just a historical curiosity, but a persistent and dangerous tendency with real-world implications. Heilbrunn argues this attraction stems from a fundamental discomfort with American democracy and a desire for a more hierarchical, illiberal order. He warns that this ongoing fascination with authoritarianism poses a threat to American ideals and institutions, and urges readers to be vigilant against its insidious appeal. Thanks for watching. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next book dive.